the basics build the strongest core. What we see in the industry today, and what we've probably seen certainly since I've been within the industry, is a lot of fads, a lot of trends that are generally started with a very enticing headline, and they're not the most effective way of improving the core, getting stronger, becoming more stable, so on and so forth. And what I've been able to do over the time that I have been in the industry is come to an understanding as to what are the basics, what are the fundamentals that build the strongest core, a strong core, a stable core, however you want to describe it. So what we're going to do in this tutorial is we're basically going to be focusing, certainly to start with, on these 4 exercises, because these 4 exercises, again, as a general rule, are the basics that build the strongest core. So this is the starting point, and this is how we build outwards. If you come to see me face to face, if you work online, if you do my online training programs, they all start from this, let's just say, beginner's standpoint. If someone comes to me more advanced, then I can start them in a more advanced way, but just having experience in the gym doesn't make you an advanced trainer, because you may not have these fundamentals in place that I'm going to be talking about. So I then have to take what would be an advanced trainer back to learn these fundamentals and these basics. So when I talk about my How to Build Core Strength and Stability 12-week program that's online, you can click the link below and find out more about it. But when I start them from beginners, that's what I mean. It's about learning the fundamentals and building through, within 12 weeks, through to more advanced and more sort of more intermediate and advanced training programs. But I'm not just throwing you in at the deep end. You're getting the basics to build on top of, because whether you're beginner, intermediate, advanced, it doesn't mean that you've got those fundamentals. It just means that you've been doing exercise for a long time. So that's where all the basics and the fundamentals and the beginners part come from. So as I mentioned, we're going to be focusing on these 4 exercises to start with, and then how we build outwards from that, and the concepts and the things that you need to learn to be able to create that strongest core that I'm talking about. As a very brief reminder, those 4 exercises, the plank, the side plank, the bridge, and the bird dog, those are the 4 fundamental exercises. Now, as it says here, or as it should say here, why do we start there? Well, it leads on to big movements. So those are relatively basic exercises, relatively simple exercises to perform. So it doesn't take a great deal of mental capacity and mental focus to perform them, because there's 3 of them are static exercises, and the 4th one, the bird dog, is generally a static exercise, but you do have to move your arm and your leg from the on all fours position and outwards. But essentially, it leads on to big movement. So what we're able to do from there is we're able to learn how to brace, how to lift joints simultaneously, how to remain stable within those positions. Because if I give someone a big movement and then try and throw all these teaching points on top of them, what generally happens is they just want to, so for example, if it's some chopping movement where they go from high up to low down, then they've got to move their whole body, their arms, their legs, they've got to twist the torso, so on, or twist from the hips, keep the position of the torso. They generally just try and get the weight from up to down, and they aren't worried about what the hip's doing. So when I say to them, could you feel your hip working? What could you feel your shoulders doing? Could you keep your arms straight whilst you were doing it? They'll go, oh, I don't know. And they'll just try and get the weight from there to there. But what we need them to be able to do is to understand what's going on within their body as they move. So all the different parts that are moving, they need to be able to consciously be aware of what's going on. So they learn the exercises and they learn specific skills within these exercises. As I've mentioned, the brace, the shoulder movement, the hip movement, the twisting or the pivoting on the toes if it's required, the hip hinging, the hip extension, the not overextending the spine but maintaining the position of the spine. All these different types of things need to come into consideration when we're learning the fundamentals. So it's just choosing something simple and then building on top of it, rather than throwing people in at the deep end and saying, right, here's a big movement, go and do it. This is what all of my training is built on. Start with the basics and grow outwards. As it says here, build a foundation of health. What that means is give you a margin of error. So a lot of people will talk about how if my sport or in everyday life, if I need to bend my spine, why do I need to do the plank? Because it's not functional, because I need to bend my spine in everyday life. Well, what we generally find is that if you can maintain a strong neutral posture, it gives you greater margin of error to come out of it. So it's much more effective to be strong within it, and then as you go through everyday life, you can be stronger without it, if that makes sense. And that is what it gives you in the way of a margin of error. So when you make that spine bending movement, it's much safer to do so. And again, that's what a lot of people mistake. And when they see me bending my spine, well, how come you can bend your spine and we can't? It's because I've built up that margin of error. So if we can build up the margin of error, it's going to be much more effective when we come out of it. We minimise compensations, and then finally it reduces risk of injury. So again, all of these things, they all work together to reduce the risk of injury to happen in the future, because we've minimised the compensation, which is going to put excess or deficient load on certain joints. We need to get those balanced. And it gives us that margin of error, so we reduce risk of injury happening in the future. And then, as it says here, normal core training exercises have a negative payoff. Spine bending exercises can damage the disc, facet joints, and fatigue muscles, leaving them vulnerable to fatigue, which is then leaving them vulnerable to injury in the future. And it's all these types of things that we need to take into consideration when, certainly for me, when I'm starting with someone, because I don't, as much as I can consult with them and ask them questions about the health of their spine and their back and their core and their hips and their shoulders and so on and so forth, it's only when we get down to practicing, so I can consult with them and ask them questions, I can assess them, but when we get into doing an hour-long session, that's, in some respects, the first two give me a good idea of where they are, then the real idea of where they are is when the actual session starts, and I still may need to sort of mould and develop the session to make it more applicable and specific to them, which is why I start from that basic standpoint with everyone, and then that helps guide me on how far out I can take them from that. So who benefits from these exercises? Well, I've mentioned them already. Beginners, because they don't know what the basics and the fundamentals are, and they're more often than not coming to me because they don't know what to do. They don't know how to do it. If it's someone that's had an injury, they're worried about making it happen again. So what we've got to do is build all of this, not only physically with the physical structure of a stronger core, but I've got to build the understanding so they can then, in some respects, be sort of confident within themselves that they know what they're doing. So it's helping them understand the anatomy, how it works, so on and so forth. So again, I've got to build it from that fundamental level. Again, as I've mentioned, regular exercise. Most of regular exercise and regular exercisers, they may have trained for a long time, but they may have trained the wrong way for a long time. They may have incomplete understandings of certain things. So where they see themselves as advanced, I may need to bring them back to the fundamentals and then build them out again to again restructure them physically and in some respects mentally with the knowledge and the understanding that they have. And as it says here, I've worked with many of them, as I've explained, and they don't have the basics. So what does it involve? Training the body to cope with the load. What have I talked about? Building that structure and training the mind to cope with the complexity. So as we go from those simple exercises and grow outwards, what we're trying to do is help them be aware of how they move. So when they do the big movements, they know what their shoulders are doing. They know that they need to pivot on their toes. They know that they need to extend the hips without extending the spine. They know they need to brace their torso whilst they're doing it. They know how to get the majority of load going through the hips rather than through the knee. All these different types of things, depending on the exercise, depending on the individual, needs to be brought into the consideration so they can start using their body correctly, so they can then start managing how their body feels. And when it does start to maybe feel not so good, they know what to do to be able to make it feel better, if that makes sense. So how do we do it? And again, this is, in some respects, how I've built my How to Build Core Strength and Stability 12-week online program, which is starting with the 4 fundamental exercises. Now, within the 12-week program, there are more than that within the fundamentals and the first part of it. Because again, those 4 fundamentals sort of are used throughout, but they sort of kind of get progressed as it goes on. When you get to the intermediate and advanced, you start to move away from them a little bit more and you don't use them quite as much. But certainly in the initial stages, because it's all about repetition and getting these exercises ingrained and getting the ability to perform them ingrained, not only physically with regards to the physical structure of the body, the muscles, the tissue, so on and so forth, but also the repetition and the motor programs within here, which basically then plays out within the body. Learn the core skills of breathing, bracing, and building endurance. So again, we've got to layer all of that in, because again, if someone's doing a plank, what's the most common thing that they do? They hold their breath. So it's one thing, okay, let's hold the plank. Okay, don't hold your breath. Breathe from the abdomen whilst bracing your stomach. All these different types of things need to be taken into consideration. Gain an understanding of joint awareness, what I've said. Joint mobility, joint stability. So understanding that, what exercises can you cope with when it comes to balance training, when it comes to stabilising the hip, when it comes to stabilising the spine? Because again, if it's too complex and you're wobbling all over the place, it's going to be ineffective because the exercise is too hard too soon. You're getting thrown in the deep end. What we need to do is get you in the shallow end and in some respects walk you into the deep end so you're much more acclimatised to that. And then move on to what I would describe as plank with arm raise and then side plank with leg raise. So here, in some respects, is sort of the first progression that you would come to with regards to how you change the exercise. So you're establishing yourself that you can hold a plank, you can hold the position, you can breathe. What we're now going to do is add extra complexity to it. We're going to lift the arm up, put it on the back, and we're going to maintain level pelvis. We're going to do the same with the side plank. We're going to hold this nice straight position, let's just say 90 degrees here, and then what we're going to do is we're going to lift this foot up, which is going to make this hip work that much harder. But what we want to try and do again is keep the hips level, so we're not sort of throwing you in at the deep end. We're learning that basics to start with, and then we're adding these types of progressions on top. So if you're a beginner that wants to learn the basics, or if you're just someone that wants to learn the basics of core training, go from that beginner's level up to the intermediates and advanced, then please do click the link below, go through to my How to Build Core Strength and Stability 12-week program, and you'll be taken through these fundamentals into more complex, harder core training, but you'll build that margin of error, you'll reduce your risk of injuries, and you'll minimize any compensation. So many thanks for watching. My name is Chris. I'll speak to you in the next tutorial.